getting late there, and you must be nearly finished. I have managed to see some of the presentations, and some of them have been very interesting. I was particularly interested in the last presentation there, where it was talking about the whole fifth industrial revolution and 7G, etc. And particularly the human side in terms of how that's going to come about and how that's going to impact. Just by way of context, I put the slide up. I thought it was interesting. It just shows the size of the market that we're talking about. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to talk about AI, because we've had lots of technical experts who are absolutely brilliant in their fields, and I am not a technical person. As Raghu said, I'm the managing partner of Be the Digital. Be the Digital is a digital transformation advisory firm. I work with boards and C-level executives primarily on digital transformation, and within that context, we look at technologies. But what I wanted to talk today was a little bit more around, what are the challenges, and equally, what are the expectations? Because as we move into this world, these are real issues that we need to deal with, because it's not just about the technology. So when we think about challenges, challenges come about both at an individual level, an organizational level, and a society level in terms of potential unintended consequences. And I was listening to one of the presentations earlier, and there was references to airplanes and automobiles and whatnot. But if you take on the individual level, there can be physical safety issues. What if autonomous vehicles get it wrong? Or what if predictive maintenance doesn't actually predict the issue and it ends up with employees being injured? Or a whole range of things like that, including misdiagnosis of, say, medical information. At an organization level, yeah, clearly you can have financial issues. I mean, you could have major losses due to an algorithm. Equally, though, your algorithm may totally misjudge something like price elasticity of supply and demand, and obviously non-financial performance issues in terms of poor resource planning, etc. But one that I would say is a big issue, an increasing issue, is reputational integrity. Because you can actually get a lot of social media backlash these days, and political backlash for getting these things wrong. And then at a society level, it's a bit more macro, but things that industries and companies are doing could have implications, particularly around infrastructure integrity. So things like power, utilities, etc. Now, there are loads of risks, and these risks can happen at the conceptual point, they can happen at the data management side, the model development side, model implementation, or the model use. And the one that I want to focus in on is the model use, in terms of how are we using data to run our organizations. And the concern that I have is that a lot of boards and a lot of senior executives don't actually understand the outcomes that are being driven for customers or other stakeholders based on algorithms that are being deployed within their business. And that, to me, creates a serious potential risk for any board or any executive committee. And if you haven't read, I would encourage you to read a book by Margaret Heffernan called Willful Blindness, where essentially she looks at the likes of Enron and says that people knew there were issues, but they didn't see it as their responsibility to call a halt to those issues. What I would say to you, in today's world, the board and the senior executive are responsible for outcomes, period, regardless of whether they have personal responsibility on a day-to-day basis. So this is something that needs to be looked at very seriously. The other issue, of course, is that there's plenty of other risks. And there was a piece done by a law firm there, and they said, look, you've got systemic risk, catastrophic risk, and you've got unmanageable risk. And they gave examples of all of them. So in terms of systemic risk, they talked about maybe a bank overcharging over a period of 2 years. In terms of catastrophic risks, they talked about maybe an air traffic control where a plane crashes due to a fault, or unmanageable risk where you have ongoing misdiagnosis of patients. And we've had a big case of litigation in Ireland in the last 2 years where cervical cancer was misdiagnosed over a long period of time, and some of those patients have died. So that's been a huge problem for the health executive and indeed for government, and it is leading to a lot of lawsuits. But when we think about the challenges that the executive face, and I was listening to some of the people today, and they're absolutely fantastic, brilliant, technically minded people. But your average board is not technically minded or IT minded. They tend to come from a diverse round of backgrounds, as does the executive team. And the things that they need to be thinking about, in my view, are they need to be thinking about bias, they need to be thinking about fairness, they need to be thinking about, the potential for exploitation, they need to think about values, accountability, ownership, and ethics. And we'll have a quick look at all of those. In terms of AI bias, well, look, bias in, bias out, and we're all biased in our own way. So whether it's conscious or unconscious, there is bias in every single one of us. And what we need to do when we're thinking about how we're using AI and algorithms, etc., to make decisions into the future, what steps are we making or taking to make sure that we're not compounding the situation? Because if we compound it in an AI world, it will be compounded at scale, and that's a real issue. Another one is fairness. How are we making sure that the decisions being derived actually are fair to all parties? Not doing something that is not in the customer's interest, for example. What I would flag here is that customer satisfaction is not the same as a good customer outcome. So a customer might be very satisfied with something that has happened, but is unaware that actually they've got a really bad deal or something that has happened that is not in their best interests. And this comes back to the whole issue of behavioral science. So the economists they argued that humans were rational. The psychologists said, well, humans are irrational. The behavioral psychologists said we can actually predict this irrational behavior, and the behavioral economists said actually we can exploit it. And this is where regulators are coming from, where they know that consumers don't necessarily act in their best interests, and that firms are aware of this and actually take advantage of it. Which leads me into my next point here, which is around exploitation. So if consumers are accepting things at face value and don't question them, we have a responsibility to make sure that in that context that they understand what they are doing and that it is a good outcome for them. One of the most critical things for me, though, is that this is around the value set of the firm. So if the firm is absolutely clear on its purpose, it's easier to talk about what sort of standards are acceptable in the firm in terms of how it does its business. If the firm isn't, you can end up with a serious disconnect in terms of I've heard organizations say, well, I didn't realize it did that. That's not acceptable, which brings me to my next point, which is all around accountability. And one of the fears that I see for boards is that humans stop taking the decisions and they allow the machines to take the decisions and they don't sense check those decisions. And if you're allowing your technology to make decisions and actually to learn and make other decisions, that's creating a serious potential risk in the firm and something that as an executive team or board, you need to make sure that you are fully on top of. So in terms of ethics, there was a piece of work done, which was done by Deloitte, which looked at, well, okay, what is the impact? Are we promoting acceptable outcomes in terms of what we are doing? And they looked at, avoiding harm. So, making sure it's safe, it's reliable, that you're dealing with privacy and cybersecurity, making sure that, that there's common good. So it's not just for the benefit of the firm, it's for the benefit of everyone. And also talked about justice. Are we treating, people fairly? And so, that looked at procedural fairness, but also, making sure that as we look at outcomes, that they are fair outcomes. And they also talked about autonomy. And in that context, they looked at, do we actually understand the decisions? Are they transparent? Are they trustworthy? Is there accountability for them? But equally from a control point of view, are we just accepting, or are we actually applying a level of human control where we're looking at these outcomes and questioning whether actually this seems right or wrong? Now, some of you might say, no, this doesn't really apply in our business. But research says otherwise. So there was a piece of research done by Capgemini in 2019. And basically what they found was that 9 out of 10 executives believe that there were ethical issues as a consequence of AI in their business in the previous 2 to 3 years. On top of that, 77% of executives were uncertain about ethics and the transparency of their AI systems. So this is a genuine issue. Why is it happening? Well, it's happening for a range of reasons. Part of the reasons is time pressure. And I'm sure you're all very busy people, and in your organizations, people are working flat out and working very hard. But if you suddenly, put time pressure on people and say, well, it needs to be done by X date, and standards get compromised. Equally, if when you're building it, if you're not taking into account, ethics, well, you're not going to have ethics by design. If anything, you'll get it by default if you're lucky. But the chances are you will miss the boat in terms of ethics. Quite often the issue is, firms don't fund it. So the project is, funded to a bare minimum. It's all going into the technical specification, and there's very little going into making sure that, we're building it right from the outset from an ethical point of view. Back to our question on bias. Well, if your team is all of the same, shape, make, and origin, you're going to get bias. So is there sufficient diversity? And this is something that firms need to look at, particularly as we build more and more algorithms. Are we making sure that we're taking steps to make sure that we have a balanced, unbiased view of the world? And then how many firms actually have a code of conduct or a code of ethics that they apply and hold the slide rule up over when they're looking at developments? So there are genuine issues, and they are documented. So what I'd be saying to, and what I do say to boards and executive teams is, the technology will do what the technology is supposed to do, but it's the humans who decide what that is, and the humans need to take steps to make sure that what you're doing is ethical and that it meets the standards expected of you. So in terms of expectations, well, the European Commission did a piece of work, and they said, look, there's 3 components, and they apply right throughout the life cycle. They must be lawful, so comply with all the laws and regulations of the land. They must be ethical, so ethical principles and values. And they must be robust, both from a technical and social perspective. So you can't have it falling over, and it has to be something that people can trust. And they said there's 7 areas to look at. So the whole human agency and oversight. Are humans standing back and looking at outcomes and sort of saying, we understand how these outcomes are being made, or actually, no, this seems strange. This outcome is not what we expected. So is there human agency and oversight? Is there technical robustness in it? Is there privacy and data governance? And privacy and data governance is a huge issue nowadays. And any firm that doesn't take this serious is in serious trouble. Transparency, is it clear? And I guarantee you, I could go to any board or executive team and ask them, do they know the basis of algorithm decision making in their firm? And the answer is going to be no. They don't. They don't need to be programmers, but they do need to understand how decisions are made. Diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness, we kind of touched on that. Society and environmental well-being, it has to be for the greater good. And above all, there needs to be accountability. If there's no accountability in the organization, well, that's fool's gold, because someone will be held to account ultimately. A piece of work done by NIST said, well, all of this needs to be explainable. So it's explanation, you need to have evidence or reasons for the outputs. So you need to be able to show that the reason we get these outcomes are based on these assumptions. It also needs to be meaningful, so that you're able to provide understandable explanations to people in terms of how you got there. It needs to be accurate. So what you think is happening in the business is actually what's happening in the business. And quite often what happens in an organization is people think something has happened or it's happening in a particular way, but what actually happens on the ground is totally different. And then obviously there are knowledge limits, and that needs to be taken into account. So when we look at broader expectations, so clearly governments are starting to take a much greater interest in this. And we've seen a number of cases in the last year, from surveillance to facial recognition, to even a big case in the United Kingdom this year where basically the exam results, which were conducted by algorithms because of COVID, were found to be biased and marginalized certain parts of the community. So governments are taking a much greater interest in this. Equally, boards are starting to look at, the basis for this. Because if you're sitting there on a board, you have a responsibility for strategy. You also have a responsibility for risk. And if you don't understand the basis on which decisions are being made in the firm, you have a serious problem. So boards increasingly are looking for understanding in terms of how this works. But it makes good business sense as well, because customers are saying is if they believe and trust in the firms to be ethical and they can trust their algorithms, etc., that they will do more business and they'll show more loyalty to the firm. So there's good business reasons to do it. And equally, from a shareholder perspective, shareholders and investors are equally saying they expect firms to have an ethical approach to technology. They expect them to make sure that there are good outcomes for employees, clients, customers, communities in which they live and work. We're all talking about ESG. AI and advanced technologies fit into this. And what we need to do as leaders of businesses is make sure that we're taking steps to mitigate bias and to make sure that there is responsibility and accountability for those working with technologies, and an understanding and ownership to make sure that what we're doing is for the greater good. So that was all I was going to cover. Hopefully I made up a bit of time for you, because I know it's getting late, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.